picking up where we left off last time, we were talking about the progressive movement, and we sort of dealt with the first part of that, and that was kind of when we look at it, especially from a top-down kind of point of view, sort of a Republican Party progressive movement. And now we're going to shift things over. We're going to be talking about Woodrow Wilson as our main kind of political actor in the second part of the 19-teens, and that's going to be sort of a Democrat progressive movement. And so we're going to talk about how Woodrow Wilson, who's even more progressive than the earliest progressives, what changes that he makes to foreign and domestic policy, but of course, a large part, basically Woodrow Wilson's second term, is completely absorbed with U.S. involvement in the First World War. But we're going to see how Wilson's progressivism plays out instead of just doing domestic policy. Now where you have a new sort of challenge with a world war, how is that going to work? And you'll see that really it's just progressivism at war. And so there's not going to be a major difference with this as well. So these are going to be our major topics for this discussion. Okay, who is Woodrow Wilson? What's the deal with this guy, right? He's the first Democratic president since 1897. You had a term with McKinley, and then basically a term, 2 terms with Roosevelt, and then you got a term with Taft. And so it's been a while. It's been a while since you had a Democrat in the White House, and he's only the second Democrat, because you had Grover Cleveland in the 1880s and the 1890s, who was the only one who had kind of broken up the string of Republican victories. He's only the second Democrat since 1861. So it had been a long time since the Democrats had managed to put together a 2-term president, and Wilson is going to be this guy. To understand a little bit of kind of how he operates, how he sees the world, you've got to understand his background as well. He's the son of a minister, so he's got a religious background. He was Southern born and bred. He was born in Virginia, and he grew up, spent a lot of his formative years in the South. He later goes on to become sort of a bookworm, a nerd kind of guy. He was an academic, and he was a professor, and he worked his way up eventually to being the president of Princeton in New Jersey. And so he is going to wind up in New Jersey as well. He becomes the governor of New Jersey in 1911 on a reform kind of platform, and the Democratic bosses kind of put this guy up there thinking, well, he's going to be a political novice, we'll be able to control him. But in reality, it turns out that Woodrow Wilson's reform program and his own sort of personality is a lot stronger than the political bosses. And he's going to go into the state of New Jersey, and he's going to make some serious reforms. And it's going to sort of not sit too well with sort of the Democratic Party leadership, but Woodrow Wilson is very serious about it. And he's going to go in, and he's going to be a real hardcore kind of progressive. Well, as we're going to see, the 1912 election, Wilson doesn't so much win on his own strength as he wins kind of by default. The Republicans kind of rip themselves apart, but that opens the door for Wilson to get into the White House. And he's going to bring his reform program based on the same kind of principles that we're going to see in some respects to Teddy Roosevelt, the idea of personal leadership of the president. He's got a legislative agenda, and he's going to go and push this to the people, and he's going to go around and bypass recalcitrant legislators if he has to. And so this is going to be his sort of modus operandi, which is very similar to what we saw with Teddy Roosevelt. Just like with Roosevelt, he is going to have a nickname for his set of policy proposals, and his progressive reforms are going to be called the New Freedom. Whether or not they're really new, or whether or not they're really freedom, I'll leave that up to you, but that's what he calls it. And so that gives us a place to start talking about with this guy. So there's Woodrow Wilson, sort of, if you say, yeah, that guy kind of looks like a college professor, sort of bookish, kind of nerdy. I don't know if he's overweight and losing his hair or not, but this is what he looks like. And one of the sort of quotes on Woodrow Wilson is that he was born halfway between the Bible and the dictionary and never really got very far from either one. And that's going to be some of his guiding principles as President of the United States. So when you look at Woodrow Wilson, what you're going to see is he is going to be pushing for the idea, he's going to champion the idea of the little man, right? And it's always a worthwhile exercise to look at the language that politicians use and ask yourself, before you even say, well, are they right or wrong, is, well, wait a minute, do I even agree with the premise that they're setting up? If he's after, when you say, I'm for the little man, well, you're for midgets, maybe the little munchkins in the Wizard of Oz. No, he doesn't mean actually physically little, people. The idea is, well, I'm the poor guy, the working guy. Well, how come he's little? If he's little, then the other people must be big. And how come I need a champion if I'm a little guy? And so, you ask yourselves these kind of questions. And of course, we don't really question this very often, although we should. Today, when we talk about politicians and the campaigns that they run and the policies that they pursue, but this is what he's going to put forward. Oh, you guys, you're poor little people. You're poor little midgets out there. You're going to be squashed by the rich guys, and I'm going to protect you. All right. And his quote on that was that you need protection from the guys behind the wall of privilege, especially sort of big banking finance kind of people. All right. Well, Wilson is going to be very serious about reducing what he reviewed as a corrupting kind of tariff. One of Wilson's major sort of themes throughout his presidency in terms of where domestic policy and foreign policy meet in terms of trade policy, and that is he's a free trade kind of guy. We need to remove trade barriers as much as possible. Well, a lot of people in Congress are making money off the back side. They're getting campaign donations from people that are making money off the tariff, and so they're a little hesitant with this. And so Wilson's going to take Congress on directly, and he's going to say, look, you guys need to do this. Well, you're not going to vote for it? Well, I'm going to go and talk to people in your district. What? I'm going to tell them that you're not going to vote for the thing that they want. So, again, this is something that presidents do now. And Roosevelt had done it a little bit, but nobody had really done it quite like Woodrow Wilson does here in the 19-teens. And we're going to see that this is very successful. Congress buckles under, and tariffs are going to come down to a great deal. All right? What you're going to see, though, is this was a point, hopefully you're sitting down while you're watching this. All right? This was a point when Congress and the federal government actually cared whether or not they were spending too much money. Maybe I need to sit down, right? So if you're going to lose money, if you're going to lose revenue off the tariff, you say, well, we're not going to tax imports as much as we used to, so that's going to mean less money to the federal government. How are we going to balance the budget? Give myself heart palpitations just thinking about actually balancing a budget. But Wilson was saying, okay, we've got a plan to make up for that loss of revenue, and what we're going to do is Wilson and Congress are going to enact an income tax. This was something, in fact, that they enacted it, and then it gets shot down by the Supreme Court, which points out very, obviously, hey, that part of the Constitution that no direct taxes on American citizens shall be levied by the federal government? Yeah, you guys totally broke that. So they had to pass and ratify an amendment to the Constitution to make it okay for Congress to directly levy taxes on individuals. And of course, the way that Wilson does this is he says, listen, you guys need to all agree to this amendment to directly tax you. Directly tax me? Well, why should I go along with it? Don't worry, none of you people are going to pay this income tax. That's only going to be for the rich. Only the rich guys are going to pay their income tax. Oh, we're going to tax other people. So for those of you who are paying your income taxes today, you're lucky. You're rich. Yeah, see, that's how government works. So anyway, this was the idea, though. We're only going to tax the wealthy, and it's going to be this relatively small kind of thing. And for those of you who, especially after you get out of college and you get a real job and you realize that the little easy form turns into these bigger forms, longer ones, and you see how much money that they're taking away from you, whoa. I had no idea I was that rich. So anyway, this is going to be a measure that he's going to take in terms related to the tariff and then taxation. All right. Second, Wilson had major problems with the banking system. He didn't like how it was working, and so he's going to urge Congress, again, personally, to try to reform the way that the banking system is. He wants to unify it with government control, but he does understand that you've got to have branches that go out into the privately held banking system. So basically, this is where the Federal Reserve System is going to go. It's also going to be one of the major problems that we'll see later with the advent of the Great Depression, the crash in 1929, because of reluctance for large-scale branch banking to get the money supply out further geographically. But anyway, this is where this is going to go. This is the system that we generally have today that we've sort of modified over time, but the federal government does have to have control of the money supply to reduce inflation, but you don't want to have so much control that people have to ask the government whether or not they can have money, to go and buy underwear and stuff like that. And it's too rigid a control. So this is the way to split the kind of difference. So for those of you that have to fill one of these out, fun, right? You get to thank Woodrow Wilson. So instead of a flat tax or something like that, where you just fill out a little form the size of a postage stamp, or perhaps a value-added tax where you just pay it every time you buy something. Well, we can't have something simple. We've got to have something complicated and relatively stupid. So this is what we get. So the next time you fill one of these out, thank you, Woodrow Wilson. Most people don't realize that we have a $100,000 bill, and they're not really in circulation. anymore, and they were never in circulation at all. And this was what the bills that they would use. You'll notice that the back of it is red instead of green, like the rest of our bills. And that is because this was for the Federal Reserve System to transfer money to other banks. It was not designed to sort of, you go in and say, wow, I want to buy this house. How much is it? $100,000. Well, here you go. Here's my $100,000 bill. You weren't really going to do that. And of course, to facilitate this, they put Wilson's head on this to remind them, hey, he created the banking system. So that's what we're going to have here. So we look at the second part of this New Freedom program. We saw that Teddy Roosevelt is a trust buster. Taft was a really big trust buster. It's a bad joke, right? And Woodrow Wilson is an even bigger. He's the biggest of the three in terms of trust busting, not in terms of physical size. Taft definitely has that one hands down, right? You're going to see that Wilson is going to enjoy an advantage that neither Roosevelt nor Taft had, and that is actual legislation, the Clayton Antitrust Act, which really gives some strength to the president's position in terms of allowing him to break up trust rather than the creaky old sort of Sherman Antitrust Act, which had some serious limits. It had some loopholes. It was hard to apply. The Clayton Antitrust Act really sort of beefs up the president's power, and it creates a commission, a board, to oversee monopolistic practices. It's one that we still have today. The Federal Trade Commission still oversees business to make sure that it's not operating a monopoly. And then also, it did exempt labor organizations from this because Woodrow Wilson is very pro-organized labor, and so he didn't want the Clayton Antitrust Act to accidentally go after them, like the Sherman Antitrust Act that accidentally sort of people had used it against unions. Well, you're operating like a group, so you're a corporation. What? So that's what you're going to see with the Clayton Antitrust Act, right? Now, he did make some concessions on the farm front to farmers of federal loans and credit. He was not really big on promoting the farm sector. I think his actual quote on farmers, when they were complaining, well, farmers aren't really making a lot of money. And he said, well, farmers never really have made a lot of money. So, not a big friend to the farmer, but that's how this goes. He is going to limit hours and child labor to a certain extent. This isn't the point where you have sort of today where, a 10-year-old, you can't go out and get a job for 40 hours a week. We're not going to sit by and watch that happen. But there are going to be some reasonable limits on that. So Wilson is going to get involved in the early processes of limiting child labor, right? Now, one of the things that you'll notice is progressives, as they look at society and they see problems, and then generally speaking, their solution to those problems is government. When they look at society and they're like, there's a lot of inequality and there's a lot of problems. One thing that should really just smack you in the face is where are the greatest sort of inequalities in American society today? Here in the early 1900s, and that's what African Americans are still struggling to get up to where they kind of ought to be after being out of slavery for 30 or 40 years, and so they're not. They're still at the bottom. So basically, they're slaves, plus 5 years. It's just no appreciable social advancement in a lot of quarters of the African American community, and so you would think, well, this is a made-to-order kind of issue, side of black people and work out this social inequality. And you will see that the Republican reformers, they were sort of interested in it. Teddy Roosevelt was kind of interested in it. Taft was interested in it. They supported the formation of the NAACP. Various Republicans did that. But of course, one of the problems with this is a lot of this is going on in states in the South that are completely controlled by the Democrat Party. And so, Republican leadership in Washington is really not a whole lot you're going to want to do in terms of political work down there because, you can't really sort of force Democrats to do what you tell them to do. Well, once you get a Democrat president, you feel, you got some now real leadership opportunities for Woodrow Wilson to get with some of these Democratic governors and these Democrat state legislators like, listen, we're progressives, you guys got to make these changes. In fact, not only did Wilson do nothing, but he's going to make things worse for African Americans. And he refused to meet with civil rights leaders and even took segregation, which had only existed at this point at the state level, to the federal government level. So now you have segregation by race that exists in the federal government. So hooray for Woodrow Wilson. This is an actual quote from Woodrow Wilson, right? When he's asked about the topic of jobs for African Americans. He's going to use the vernacular of the day. He says, there are no government position for Negroes in the South. A Negro's place is in the cornfield. There you go. President of the United States committed to reforms and evening out the inequalities in society. Thank you, Woodrow Wilson. So these are the ideas that he has. How is he going to apply this to the rest of the world? Like I said, he is a minister's son. He disliked imperialism on sort of religious and moral grounds. He says that, no, we shouldn't be going and beating up all these people and getting involved in this kind of thing. All these activities we've been doing, it makes them mad at us. And okay, if that's your opinion, that's fine. And so he's going to pursue that for a while, right? And he seeks to extract the United States from expansionism, and he wants to try to use morality to guide American foreign policy. He called this the idea of missionary diplomacy, right? The idea that we're going to use Christian principles to guide us in terms of our relationship to other nations. As we're going to see, Wilson actually eventually is going to abandon these ideas because it turns out that they don't work. All right. Now, initially, Wilson's going to take the U.S. out of these aggressive policies. He ended the dollar diplomacy programs with these Central American countries. He's going to grant the Philippines a territorial status, which means they've got a certain amount of representation, and they've got certain, sort of protection as part of the United States government, rather than just a protectorate, which is something the United States can just, kind of smack around. And he's going to give the Panama Canal tolls back to the Panamanians rather than keeping them for the United States. Okay. As things went on, though, right, what you're going to see is reality begins to bite Woodrow Wilson in the fanny, right? And as we're going to see, Americans that are doing business in Haiti, there's a great deal of social discord in Haiti to this day, and it's no different in Woodrow Wilson's during Woodrow Wilson's term of office. And as rioting among Haitians sort of engulfs this island nation, he's forced to send the United States Marines in to kind of protect these Americans and kind of break up what's going on, to prevent a lot of people from getting killed. You got to send the Marines to beat people up. Christian principles, okay, right? He's going to send troops to end riots in the Dominican Republic because it's threatening Americans down there, and of course the collection of tolls, and you may have Europeans come back in. He's going to purchase the Virgin Islands to strengthen the U.S. military presence in the Caribbean. I thought we were going to expand, take places over because you didn't, the Virgin Islands, that's too much of a plum to pass on. And so that's what you're going to have here. If you're going to look at Woodrow Wilson's least sort of missionary diplomatic episode, it's going to involve the country of Mexico. For those of you that don't know a lot about the history of the country of Mexico, basically you've got a series of corrupt governments. It's maybe a little less corrupt today, maybe, right? But you've got some pretty bad eggs in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and you're going to have basically a series of revolutions. And you're going to have another one of these revolutions that's going to take place here in 1913, all right? And you're going to have a pretty brutal dictator, a guy named Huerta, right? And Huerta, he's going to be the strong man that's going to rise to the top here in amongst the chaos, and he is going to seize control of the Mexican government. So he's a dictator, he uses force, he seizes power. Should be pretty easy to understand. Woodrow Wilson didn't like this guy. He referred to Huerta as the brute, right? And relations between the United States and Mexico are extremely strained when several sailors of a U.S. vessel that's visiting Veracruz, they are arrested for doing silly sailor stuff. All right. For those of you that don't spend a lot of time around sailors, when you're trapped on a great big metal boat with a whole bunch of other dudes, and you finally get off the port, you go off and you get drunk and you do stupid stuff. Well, sometimes when you get drunk and you do stupid stuff, you get arrested. This is actually pretty normal behavior for sailors. Okay, not to ding any sailors, but this is what they do. They get arrested. The consulate gets involved. They get our sailors out of jail. We apologize to the foreign government, and then we take the sailors on board the ship and spank them or something like that. So anyway, this is how it goes. But because of bad relations between the United States and Mexico, we go in and say, okay, you got our sailors. We're really sorry. They painted themselves red and ran through the streets naked or whatever it was that they did. Can we have them back? Mexico said no. They broke the law. They got to be punished in a Mexican court. No, you got to give them back. We'll punish them. You don't have to worry about it. We'll pay for any damage they caused. And they said no, we're not going to give them back. Well, Wilson decides, fine, we're going to seize your port city. Okay, stop here for just a second. I want you to understand something. When you have a foreign government, they come in with like a battleship and troops and they seize one of your cities. That's called an act of war. If people came in and captured like New York or Boston or Philadelphia, we don't just sit around and go, hey, you guys really ought to give that back. No fair. No, you start bombing them, right? I mean, you don't wait around. There's no sort of political procedure for what you do. You fight them, and that's exactly what takes place. And it looks like war is going to be imminent between the United States and Mexico because you seize people's cities, and that's what you do. You fight wars. Okay. The problem is, though, due to the political pressure of all this exertion that Wilson and then the threat of war puts on Huerta's regime, which is built on a pretty shaky foundation anyway, his government falls apart. It collapses. And he's replaced by a different dictator, a guy named Carranza, okay? And Wilson, okay, Carranza's not as bad as Huerta. I can work with this guy. They work out their little peace agreement, give the Mexicans their city back, they give us our soldiers, or they give us our sailors back, okay? The fly in the ointment, all of this, is during these series of revolutions, Carranza had been one of these guys sort of trying to work his way to the top. And one of his allies had been this guy named Francisco Villa, and his nickname was Pancho, right? One of the cool nicknames of all time in American history. And they had been friends for a while, and then when Carranza sort of rises to the top, Villa looks at him, why, you're sort of betraying, what we wanted to do. And so basically, Villa also looks at this is basically Wilson, making Mexico into a puppet state, which isn't totally true, but that's how Villa takes it, okay? And so he's going to lead a rebellion against the Carranza government, and then also against Wilson's interference or his perceived interference in Mexican politics, all right? So what he does is he wants to try to provoke a war. He wants to try to provoke a war between the United States and Mexico. And so Villa crossed the American border after attacking some Americans in northern Mexico. And then he goes across the Rio Grande, he goes into the southern part of the United States, and he attacks several American cities, and then he withdraws across the border. And of course, the Woodrow Wilson administration gets with Mexico and is like, hey, you need to get this guy Villa under control. He's a terrorist. He's attacking our cities. He's burning stuff down. He's killing Americans. He's crossing into our territory, and he's attacking us. Are you guys going to do anything about it? And of course, Carranza's like, Villa's crazy. I'm not going anywhere near that guy. So Wilson informs the Mexican government, all right, fine, we're going to send our military into Mexico. We're not going to conquer anything. We're not going to take any of your cities or your oil or anything. We're going to go after Villa. We're going to, grab him or kill him, and then we're going to leave. So you guys just got to deal with it, right? So Carranza kind of has to grit his teeth as an American army goes in, and Wilson sends in this Army Expeditionary Force under the command of John J. Pershing, and he tries to go after Villa, who, of course, gets away. Villa's guys were all in trucks and cars for the most part, and the U.S. military goes in on horseback to try to catch this guy. Of course, Villa knows the terrain, he knows the people. And so this really isn't Wilson's brightest hour. He sends this army in to go and find Villa, and all they come up with is bupkis. This is Pancho Villa, and this is his band of revolutionaries. So anyway, this is what they look like. And of course, there was a $5,000 reward, right, for Pancho Villa here in the 19-teens. This is where these U.S. posters, wanted posters, will look like. There was actually a pretty good movie done by HBO Films a few years ago starring Antonio Banderas as Pancho Villa. One of the ways that Pancho Villa financed his revolution prior to attacking the United States was he got American film companies to come down and basically film his battles. So they would show these films back in the United States as these movies, and they sort of cut them and splice them together so it would make a kind of coherent story. So when you saw people getting shot, they were people getting shot. It wasn't like an extra with like a squib that made a little poof when he went down, and it was like bam, that guy got shot. No, he's really dead. So it was a real guy. He really got shot. So this is how Villa made some money to buy guns and ammunition for his little revolution. It's a pretty good film. It's a little long, a little talky, but it gives you an idea of kind of what's going on. This is John J. Pershing. He's leading his troops. They're crossing the Rio Grande. We're going to go after Pancho Villa. But this is a political cartoon of basically what happened to him. All the snakes just kind of came out, and he spends a lot of time stomping them, and he never winds up getting Villa. They're not actually real snakes. It was just a metaphor. All right, the major event that's going to overshadow really all of Woodrow Wilson's presidency, even though the United States only gets involved in the second term for a couple of years of the fighting, and that is going to be World War I. And we've got to do a little bit of world history to kind of back this up and make this understandable, all right? And war is going to break out in Europe in August of 1914, and basically it's going to suck in really the whole world, including, eventually, the United States. It's sort of to everyone's surprise, but really it shouldn't have been. There are four kind of main long-term causes for this. One, you've got European nationalism. This is desire for national competition. We are French, and you are German, and we are awesome, and you suck. And we want to just beat the crap out of you. And of course, the Germans feel the same way. The British feel the same way. The Italians, the Russians. This growing idea of nationalism. It has sort of a positive outlet. You see this with the Olympics and things like that. They just sort of compete against each other without anybody having to die. Economically, we compete with other nations, and as long as it's sort of fair and above board, everybody kind of wins that way. But one of the uglier sides of this is it has a military, I want to go and kill other people in other nations kind of component, which is not very healthy for really anybody. You have the rise of militarism in a lot of these places, and that is directly coupled to industrialization, because industrialization had led to a massive and rapid increase in military sizes and their technological capabilities. So we're going to see for the first time a massive industrial war led by industrial nations, and it's going to be sort of industrial strength killing that's going to take place. And as these people are building bigger and bigger militaries, all this is tax money that the taxpayers of these countries are shelling out. And sort of like, you spend a lot of money on that Corvette, and it looks really good in the garage, but eventually, I'm going to bust that thing out on the highway and do 180. So this is what you're going to see is one of the major causes that is going to be pushing these guys towards war as they up the ante, building their militaries bigger and bigger to try to gain a military advantage over each other. It makes all these governments more and more nervous. As these militaries get bigger and bigger, we need to stop these guys before they crush us. Okay? Imperialism is also going to play a major role. As we've seen in the late 19th and on into the early 20th century, it isn't just the United States that's involved in imperial activity. In fact, the United States is actually a pretty tepid partner in all of this. So these European powers are really going whole hog for controlling places in Africa and in Asia. And a lot of these countries that are late to the party, especially Germany, they want to gain these colonies. And of course, the countries that have the most to lose, especially Britain, are going to be very fearful and want to fight to try to maintain their colonial holdings around the world. And the last one is the political failures of the secret alliance system. Anybody who's trying to get a boyfriend or a girlfriend in junior high understands how ridiculously stupid the secret alliance system is. Which is, hey, are you on my side? Are you on their side? Well, what are you going to do? Or, what's with it? Are you going to declare, if I declare war on them, are you going to declare war on these guys to watch what I'm doing? Or what do you think they're doing? It's just ridiculous. Just come right out and say, look, hey, we've got this problem. Are you going to attack me? Do you want me to attack you? What's going on? And so instead of sort of open concourse, you've got all these different people and making these calculations, and as we're going to see, a whole bunch of miscalculations as about what is going to take place. All right? This world war that is going to eventually consume tens of millions of lives is going to start with just one guy getting shot. And that is the heir to the Habsburg throne, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He's going to be visiting Sarajevo, which is right next to Serbia. And so the Serbian nationalist doesn't like the fact that the Habsburg monarchy is kind of squishing their nationalism, right? That he's too much influence in Serbia, and they want to get rid of him. They want to strike a blow. And so you got these Black Hand, a group of basically terrorists. They're assassins. And they're not very good ones, at least they're not very professional ones. But they're successful enough because one of their guys, Gavrilo Princip, he manages to assassinate Franz Ferdinand. Okay, he's the heir to the Austrian throne, and so he manages to pull off this assassination. Now, Austria-Hungary is very understandably upset by this. And you would think, well, this seems pretty straightforward. They go in and say, hey, you Serbians, you need to give us all these Black Hand terrorists that are hiding in your country. Serbia says, no. They're ours, and you can't have it. Well, Austria-Hungary just declares war. Serbia's tiny, They go in and they smack the Serbs around, right? The problem is, though, the secret alliance system. Austria-Hungary is worried that Serbia is allied with Russia because Serbia is the same ethnic group, Slavic, as the Russians are. And so, ironically, Russia was kind of looking at, hey, Serbs, you may just get what you've got coming to you. But as Austria begins to contact its allies and say, hey, you guys gonna back us up if we have to go to war with Russia? And of course Russia's like, wait a minute, they're planning war against us. What did we do? Well, we need to mobilize our forces. And of course Austria, they're starting to mobilize their forces. Germany, what does it do? Eventually, Germany, under Kaiser Wilhelm's government, gives them what is referred to as the carte blanche, the blank check, right? And says, all right, you guys go ahead, go to war with Serbia. And all this dithering that takes place for a month, had Austria-Hungary probably just gone in, hauled off, and just belted Serbia and declared war on them, it would have been no big deal. probably. Okay, don't know that for sure. But what we get instead is a whole bunch of other whispering. What's going to do what? Oh, and of course Russia. Well, we may go to war with these guys. And France, you're our ally. You may have to come in on this, and so it gets pretty epic in terms of its proportions, and it goes out of control. All right. Hopefully you're sitting down. You may want to actually lean back from the computer a little bit as you're watching this, because this is not going to make sense. All right. So here's a series of events. Austria is going to declare war on Serbia. Now remember, the Serbs are Slavs. Russia is going to declare war on Austria. The Russians are also Slavs. Right. Germany is Austria's military ally, and so Germany declares war on Russia and attacks France. Because, see, Germany's here in the middle, and they're worried about having to fight a two-front war against Russia and France. And so their military plan had been, well, what we're going to do is we're going to send most of our military through what's called the Schlieffen Plan to attack France very quickly. We're going to sweep down through these countries, through Belgium, and attack them mostly from the north. All right, and we're going to knock France out very quickly, so that way then we can shift most of our troops using the railways inside Germany back to the Eastern Front. But there's a problem. France hasn't declared war on us. Well, we can't change the plan, can we? So anyway, yeah, so Germany declares war on Russia and attacks France. Well, the military plan called for Germany to invade Belgium, because Belgium is nice and flat and open, and it has a good road system, and of course Belgium is neutral. They don't want to be any part of this. And when Germany invades Belgium, Belgium's ally, England, declares war on Germany, which then brings in, of course, all of England's overseas empire to declare war. So places like Canada and India and South Africa are going to declare war on Germany as well. So, are you cross-eyed yet? So we're going to have two main teams as we get started here. All right? The main allies initially are going to be Russia, Britain, and France. We're going to see adding to this is going to be Italy. Part of the miscalculation of the secret alliance system is that Italy was going to be on the side of these guys that we'll call the, eventually called the Central Powers. And instead, Italy decides, instead of being Austria's ally, it would be better if we backed out and sided with these other people and attacked Austria because we can take some of their territory. So you can imagine Austria and Germany thinking, well, we've got Italy as an ally. That'll be good. And instead, no, they switch teams and now are on other people's sides. Great, okay? Allies are going to have the weight of their extensive overseas empire to bring in terms of manpower, material, economic activity. They're also going to be able to harshly blockade the German coastline, and we're going to see that this is going to cause one of the major economic problems for the Central Powers. And that's these guys. This is another team, all right? Basically, it's Germany. Germany's the main partner of the Central Powers. And you've got sort of Germany and the others. Right? You do have Austria-Hungary, and you do have the Ottoman Empire. All right? They have very limited imperial strength upon which they can draw. Also, as I mentioned, the Allies' naval dominance is going to allow this blockade of these North Sea and Baltic ports, which eventually, by the end of the war, is really going to cripple the German economy. You're going to have German civilians making coffee out of walnut shells and stuff like that. And they're almost starving to death by the end of the war because of the total lack of trade that's taking place here in Germany. All right? Now, the initial phase of the war sees the Central Powers, especially Germany, they're really kind of winning the war. In the east, they set a couple of traps for the Russians. They beat them at the Battle of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, and then they just sort of beat the stuffing out of these guys. And they basically, from that point forward, from 1914 kind of onward, they've got the Russians kind of on the ropes, and they're starting to push these guys backward. But the main part of the plan initially was to sweep into France, and they're going to come in and they're going to kind of sucker these guys to attack, the French to attack them in the south, and then they're going to swing down from the north through what was referred to as the Schlieffen Plan, and it comes very close to working. They very nearly capture the capital of Paris, which is not only the political capital, but it's also the industrial capital. It's the road network. Basically, Paris is kind of the nerve center of France. However, the British are going to get involved. They're going to slow the Germans down in their advance at Mons and some other places. And this is going to allow the French to kind of get their act back together. And the French are going to launch a series of counterattacks against these overextended German positions all along the Marne River. All right? And so really here, the war of maneuver is going to kind of slam into each other along the Marne River. It's going to kind of stop, and both sides are kind of... Neither side really has the strength anymore to kind of push the other one out of the way. And so what they're going to do is both of them are going to try to outflank each other. And as they do that, they're going to try to they're going to wind up working ever increasingly northward until by the end of the year, both armies had dug into these kind of defensive positions because they don't have the strength to go really on offense in the rest of 1914. And you're going to have basically a long series of trenches that go from the North Sea all the way down to the mountains of Switzerland. So for most of the rest of the war of maneuver is going to end, and we're going to see instead trench warfare is going to replace it. So here you can see the Schlieffen Plan, the sweep through Belgium as it takes place in 1914. Right? So when we look at the war that's taking place here in 1915 through 1917, as I mentioned, the war becomes basically a stalemate. Neither side has the strength to kind of knock each other out of the way because there's no way to go around. There's only through. And you've got to attack these guys that are in these deep entrenchments with these machine guns, and you've got to go up and over into no man's land. And these guys are forced to live in some relatively horrid conditions. You know, you got mud, you got rats, you got the blue bottle fly, you got all these diseases from all these decomposing bodies. You've got artillery that's just sort of coming in, maybe at all hours of the day or night. The terrain all around you is getting blasted to pieces. Starting in some cases looking like sort of the surface of the moon. Now the Germans, as I mentioned, are managing on the eastern front a great deal more success because the terrain is a lot more open, and so you can't get a continuous line. And so the Germans are much more successful. They would eventually win the war, but it's going to take them so long because the Russians have so far to fall back. And also the Germans kind of spend a lot of their resources in fighting a major battle at Verdun in France in 1916. But so it's going to take these guys, it's going to take the Germans until the late 1917 before they're finally able to knock the Russians out of the war. And Russians, of course, are going to have their communist revolution that takes place in October and November of 1917. So in the West, as I mentioned, the Germans can't break through at Verdun. They lose huge numbers of troops. The British can't break through at the Somme River. They're using the same kind of idea. They come up and out of these trenches, and the Germans just machine gun these people down. Okay, and the French are going to fail to break through along the Aisne River here in 1917. It gets so bad that actually the French mutiny for a while. The French army, screw this, we're going to go home. And of course, well, no, you guys need to stick around because if you guys just give up and quit, then the Germans will win the war. And so you need to at least, we won't make you attack machine guns, at least not right now. But you need to at least man the defenses. Okay, so. There's no sort of way to win the war the way they're doing it. So the Germans are looking at trying to find a way to win the war other than trench warfare. Okay? So if we try to defeat the Allies, we've got to find some way to do it other than fighting on land. So this gives you an idea of kind of how the fighting looks like. This is the British Expeditionary Force, one of their relatively small kind of platoon-sized trenches in 1914. It's short, it kind of comes to an end. It's relatively shallow. There's no other equipment like sandbags or barbed wire or any of that kind of stuff around it. And so you can see how this evolves a little bit later on. These are the trench lines. This is the furthest extent that the Germans are going to have in 1914. And eventually they sort of race against each other until eventually the lines are going to extend all the way down here along the western front. And so there's no way to go around. This is an artist's diagram to give you an idea of what life in the trenches really kind of look like. To give you an idea of, you get your forward trench and you get your other trenches, and so it's sort of like living like a rat in a maze, or especially some of these underground galleries that they dig to prevent being blown up in a bombardment. You're living like a rat in a hole. So it's pretty bad stuff with this. And so this is the problem here with trench warfare, is that defense has now trumped offense because of things like bolt action, quick firing rifles, and then of course the machine gun. Is going to mean that just a relatively few number of people, if they've got the right equipment, machine guns and rifles and grenades and things like that, you can hold off a huge number of attackers. If you're in a good entrenched position, you got a machine gun, you can hold off maybe 100 guys. And you can exact such heavy casualties that's what the problem is going to be through much of trench warfare. And so you've got to try to work your way through the barbed wire entanglements. And here you can see some German pioneers, these assault engineers. And one guy's chucking a hand grenade to keep these other guys heads down as these other guys are cutting their way through the belts and belts of wire. This is a little bit of American propaganda. It's not exactly what the fighting would look like, because as you can see, they're all wearing their hats rather than their garrison caps instead of their helmets. And of course, this one guy's got a very heroic death, you know. And of course, this guy, he's being pretty heroic too. He's at the top of the wall, and you know, I'm striking a blow for liberty. Aaron's been shot. And so, again, this is an artist's rendition, not an actual photograph. But it does give you a pretty good idea of how sort of torn up the terrain is. You get these belts of barbed wire, you get these sandbag embrasures, you get these firing loops that these guys can fire rifles out of that can be completely protected. So that's what you would see on the ground level. If you look at things from the air, though, this is a stretch of British trench, photographed from an airplane. And all of these are shell holes from shells that, you know, sort of fall in the no man's land in between the British trench and the German one that's just off the camera frame. And all these sort of bombardment craters, this is what you would see everywhere. This is what would have been a cute little forest before the war. You know, you maybe go with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, you hold hands, and you take a little stroll. And now it looks like a whole bunch of burned out matchsticks. You know, you get nothing but cinders and blown up equipment and dead bodies everywhere. And so this is what these places that are caught between the lines eventually begin to look like. And of course, you've just got piles and piles of corpses. The bluebottle fly is, you know, working all through these dead bodies that are trapped in no man's land. It's not like you can, hey, we're going to get the bodies. You guys don't shoot us while we're out there. You just got to kind of leave them there. And of course, you've got the rats that find these guys. And according to the primary source data of the guys that were there, they said that the rats were eating so well that they were the size of cats. So that's pretty gross. So you can see how eventually the trenches would evolve. This is the French troops. They're in their trench here in 1916. And they've got barbed wire strung in front of their trench. They've got barbed wire over their trench to prevent the Germans from jumping into it. They've got sandbags, and of course, it's so deep that you can actually stand up in it, and you're still below the lip of the parapet at the top, and you would actually have a little board. You'd step up on the board, and you'd fire when the Germans were attacking. For the most part, you could just stand up, and you wouldn't have to bend over to keep yourself protected. So that's how bad this was. Of course, these trenches are going to fill up with water when it rains. So you got a lot of mud, you got a lot of diseases that are spread that way. And just to make things worse, we're going to see that this is the first major war, at least in the industrial era, where we're going to see the use of chemical warfare. So this is the release of poison gas. You're going to see things like chlorine gas, and mustard gas, and phosgene gas. And so just when you thought that life at the front just couldn't get any worse, now you got to spend all the time wearing gas masks. So, I mean, it already looks like the surface of the moon, so you might as well have to dress like it anyway. So this is what you're going to see. And this is an American sort of training picture. The guys wearing the gas masks live. The guy who didn't put his gas mask on, he's dying a rather dramatic death. And again, he's not really dying. It's just a staged photograph. But it gives you an idea of kind of what this would look like. And of course, these are some American soldiers that have been gassed. Mustard gas especially causes your mucous membranes to detach. It often causes your eyes to cloud over. In some cases, you don't get your sight back, but for the most part, you do. But it's designed to injure you rather than kill you, so that way you then have to be taken care of by other soldiers rather than just sort of buried like a corpse. So that's how that works, right? So this solution that the Germans are going to try to go to is they're going to rely on their navy to blockade England and try to starve England out and knock it out of the war in this way, right? Now, of course, Germany doesn't have a very large surface fleet. It's almost as big as the British. In 1916, they're going to fight kind of a draw type of battle off Denmark, a battle of Jutland. But it's not enough to kind of knock the British Navy, you know, out of the way. So what can slip past the British blockade undetected and then blockade England's coastlines and our surface fleet? Well, it's these U-boats, the Unterseeboot, right? Or literally submarines, okay? And so you don't use them to attack the British, you know, battleships and destroyers and cruisers and stuff like that. You go after their merchant fleet, so that way they can't get food and gasoline and reinforcements and ammunition and things like that that's coming into England by ship. Now, these U-boats are sinking vessels that are in British water, but the problem here is that ever increasingly the tactics that the U-boats have to use seem really like foul play, especially to Americans. You see, war on merchant shipping is an acceptable port of warfare. That's just, you know, that's just how it goes. You sink their ships, all right? But in prior centuries, the way that it worked was you would have a big sort of ship, and you'd signal this merchant ship from another country, hey, you need to stop, and you need to let us, you know, board you and capture you. And if they didn't, then you got to blow them out of the water. And then, of course, these guys are splashed around in the water, and you pick them up and you make them your prisoner, all right? Well, you can't do that with a submarine. Submarines are relatively slow-moving, and they rely on surprise as their major weapon. So you can't signal these guys, all right, you guys surrender, we're a submarine, because they're just going to turn around and they're going to go the other way. and you're not going to be able to shoot them. So, and of course, when you do sneak up on these guys and say, okay, put a torpedo right into them, and you blow them up, and all these survivors are kind of splashed around the water. I mean, these submarines are like little sardine cans. There's barely enough room for the crew that they have. They're not picking up any survivors. They're just going to let you freeze to death in the waters of the North Atlantic. So it seems like kind of dirty pool to a lot of people, especially to the Americans. In 1915, a British ship, the Lusitania, is torpedoed off the Irish coast. Despite the British sort of propaganda that, it was a peaceful ship, it only had people. No, it was carrying weapons. It was a legitimate military target, but there were 128 Americans on board. Now, you would think that there should be 128 people in America with enough sense to not sail on a ship to an island that's being blockaded by submarines and then be surprised when you get blown up by a submarine. But these are Americans, and the Americans are kind of outraged at this. They're killing our people. So Wilson demanded that the sinking stop. The Germans are going to sink several more ships. It looks like the United States is going to declare war here in 1915 on Germany over this issue. But eventually the Germans decide, okay, we don't want to risk war. We may be able to win the war by other means, and we're going to see they're going to try to do this in 1916, the Battle of Verdun, and it's not going to work out. So the Germans are going to pay off the Americans. They're going to say, okay, we're sorry we blew up a bunch of your people and some of your ships, and they promise not to do this anymore. We're not going to attack you with submarines anymore. This is one of these World War I German submarines, to give you an idea of kind of how small and tightly packed these things were, because that's like 6 guys on the deck of this thing, and they're all sort of, 5 of them are peeping out of the conning tower. There's barely enough room for them there. So they're pretty small. This is the artist's rendition of the Lusitania going down. Why not, right? This is the New York Times headlines of this: the Lusitania sunk by submarine. Probably 1,260 dead. Twice torpedoed off the Irish coast. Sinks in 15 minutes. Blah, 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 blah. So anyway, this is the notice, though, that you would see if you were going to be traveling on the high seas. And this is put up there by the Imperial German Embassy. Hey, dummy, there's a war on. If you sail to Britain on a ship that's British, we're going to shoot at it. And if you're on it, you're going to get shot at too. So don't be stupid. But anyway, this is what you would see in the ports of America, right? Well, in 1916, we've got a political event, right? Woodrow Wilson, he's running for re-election. Anti-war sentiment in the United States is still really strong. The United States citizenry at this point, we really don't want to be in the war. If the Europeans, if they want to kill each other, cool, right? Blow each other away, leave us out of it, okay? The U-boat incidents had caused some tension, but even despite that, a lot of Americans really don't want to get involved in this fighting, right? There have been a lot of British propaganda sort of visited to the United States on how evil the Germans were and how they were the Hun, from Central Asia, and they were going to destroy civilization. And that had made some inroads with the American people, but for the most part, the prevailing opinion was, we don't want to have any part of this war over there in Europe. And in fact, Wilson runs for re-election. Part of his slogan was, he kept us out of war. The implication, of course, being that a vote for Wilson would be a vote to keep the United States neutral in his second term. Now remember, Wilson doesn't get a majority of the vote in 1912 when he wins. He only wins because of a split in the Republicans. He only gets 42% of the popular vote. But he is a sitting president. He does have a decent sort of record, and of course you run on the idea that, hey, do you want to get involved in war? No. Well, I kept us out so far. And so Wilson is going to win. He sort of squeaks one out in 1916. But soon following his inauguration, the Germans are going to make him rethink that whole kept us out of war business. And the Germans can't wait any longer to try to starve out England. They're getting ever increasingly desperate. And they announced a program of what they refer to as unrestricted submarine warfare. Basically, any ship at all, if it's going toward Britain, even if it's an American ship, we're going to sink it. We're not even going to allow the United States to trade with Britain. Right on the heels of this, you're going to have then the Zimmermann telegram. Okay, this was something that was basically stolen by the British and then published, and it's where the German foreign minister, Arthur Zimmermann, he proposed that Mexico would attack the United States as Germany's ally. And in the fighting, because Germany eventually is going to win the war and it's going to become this great world power, and in return for Mexico basically keeping the United States busy, he knew that Mexico couldn't defeat the United States, but they could sort of keep the United States' eye off the ball. At the end of the war, the Germans would make sure that Mexico would pick up Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona as compensation from the United States. Well, you can imagine the effect this has on the Americans. It says, oh, you're plotting with our neighbor to have them attack us, and you're going to give them our stuff. So all of this adds together, and the guy who ran just a few months earlier on, he kept us out of war, on April 2nd, 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Imperial Germany, and Congress, of course, would comply. For those of you who thought I made up the whole who keeps us out of war thing, there it is, who keeps us out of war. There's Woodrow Wilson. There's one of his little campaign wagons as it's going through the streets of America in 1916. So he does win. He does win re-election, although it is a squeaker. He wins 49% of the vote, so he still doesn't get quite a majority. And he only gets 52% of the Electoral College. So it's a pretty close election. One state, sort of switches sides, probably, Ohio. And, you got a very different sort of outcome with this. This is a translated copy of the Zimmerman telegram, and where it describes, hey, Mexico, go attack the United States. We'll make sure that you get Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona back. So, anyway, that's what's going on with that. All right. So now Woodrow Wilson is the leader of a nation involved in a great world war. So he's going to stop being Woodrow Wilson because the situation's changed, right? Not one teeny tiny little bit, okay? His ideals are now just going to get translated to a new goal. Instead of the new freedom programs and attacking the walls of privilege and championing the little man and missionary diplomacy. Nope, we're going to take all that and we're going to transfer it over to winning the war, okay? He referred to this was the war, and it's going to be rough, but it's going to be the war to end all wars, because at the end of it, we're going to solve all these problems, and he's going to make the world safe for democracy, okay? If you haven't got the idea that Woodrow Wilson is mostly full of crap by now, all right, you really should. To codify these goals, Wilson had issued, even before the United States got involved with the fighting, 14 points. These are policy objectives that were proposals that Wilson had for the European powers to come to a peace settlement before the United States got involved. He is going to use these again, now that the United States is involved, as basically sort of guiding principles for what the United States is fighting for. All right? And I'm not going to go through all 14 of these. You guys can Google it if you want to find them all. But basically the most salient ones is, one, abolish all the secret alliances. We want to get rid of that. This is an important objective for the Americans, have neutrality of the seas. All right? If we're not at your war, all right, then don't attack our ships on the high seas. The United States has now declared war twice, basically 100 years apart, once in the War of 1812, and then again in World War I over this issue. Don't mess with our shipping and our trade if we're neutral. All right? 3, he wants to see lower trade barriers. Part of the reason why we're fighting each other is because we're not trading with each other. Instead of trying to fight each other and take each other's stuff, how about I give you what I don't need, and then you give me what you don't need. We trade, and then we're both happy, and nobody has to die. All right? He wants to see reduced colonialism, because colonialism and imperialism leads to people wanting to fight each other for various colonial possessions. He wants to see arms reductions. If we can blow each other up 2 times over, how about we walk it back to just blow each other up 1 time over, right? There are also specific goals for nation-states for self-determination, and that's most of the points numerically, right? Now, the last point was a proposal of what he referred to as a League of Nations, and this is where countries would meet, and then they would be equals, and they would talk about their problems instead of resorting to violence and secret alliances. And so this is the actual series of quotes from the most salient portions of the 14 points, open covenants of peace, absolute freedom upon the seas, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, like I said, you guys can look that up if you're interested in this, all right? Now, when the United States was neutral, most of the American population is pretty neutral, but the declaration of war has a really galvanizing effect, and it stirs some pretty strong nationalist feelings within America. And the government is going to mobilize everybody. They need everybody to buy into this, because it isn't just the soldiers that's going to go and fight. They need people working in the factories. They're going to ration food. They're going to be in control of a large part of the American economy. They need everybody to buy into this. And so the idea that we're going to go over, we're going to fight, we're going to blow up Germans, everybody needs to get on board with that idea. And so the United States government is going to begin a systematic propaganda campaign. They want to rally public support for the war and against the enemy. All right? Public sentiment is soon going to turn pretty virulent, and in some cases violent, against anything or anyone who is seen as too German. For example, this is when, Wieners, right? Wieners, are going to be changed to hot dog, sometimes referred to as victory sausage. You'll see sauerkraut is going to be turned into victory cabbage. A lot of people with German last names are going to anglicize them. Von Braun is going to be Brown. Guys with German last names are going to change, so that way they don't get beat up, right? And we're going to see in some cases people who are kind of socialists and they oppose the war, and especially ones with German accents, they're going to get beat up, and I think even one guy's going to get hung. Okay? The government is also going to step in here and get involved with this, passing the Espionage and Sedition Acts. And the espionage part is pretty straightforward. You know, don't be a spy and try to like blow up stuff for a foreign government. That seems pretty straightforward. And the government ought to have power to prevent you from, you know, putting a bomb in like the weapons factory, so that way, you know, Germany has an advantage in the war. Yeah, that makes sense. It's the Sedition Act part that really is going to rub basically all of us the wrong way, and that's barred any action or speech that would hinder the U.S. war effort. You spoke out against the war, there's a good chance the government could come and get you. You know, what about the First Amendment? What about that? Okay? Well, this wasn't just a small thing. This wasn't something that Congress just kind of passed as like a scare tactic. Hey, don't do that. Don't do it. No, they're very serious about this. 1,900 prosecutions are going to result from these laws. Okay? A lot of people, a lot of these 1,900 are going to go to jail, and they're going to stay in jail well into the 1920s. So it isn't just one of the things where, you know, well, these guys may be troublemakers, and we're going to put them in jail. Well, as soon as the war's over, we'll let them out. Lincoln did this in the Civil War. There were some people that he kind of locked up and kind of played fast and loose with the Constitution. But, of course, when the war's over, they all have to go home. That was not the case with these guys, all right? So it seems like blatant flouting of the First Amendment, and somebody ought to sue. Well, somebody did, and it works its way up to the Supreme Court. And the court upheld the laws as necessary against speech that represented a clear and present danger to the nation at wartime. So, yeah. I guess First Amendment only goes so far, at least according to the Supreme Court. So here's some fun propaganda that sort of works its way out from the United States government, right? Beat back the Hun with Liberty Bonds. And you've got this German soldier, he's a giant, he's wrecked Europe. You can see the Atlantic Ocean there, and he's got blood on his hands. He looks like he's about to leap across the Atlantic and stab you in your heart with his bayonet, right? What a cold, heartless killer that he is. So buy Liberty Bonds, don't let the guy come over and stab you. This one's great because it's got racism and sex all rolled into it, right? Destroy this mad brute. Right? And so you've got our dark, sort of ape-like feature with the Kaiser's Pickelhaube helmet on it, and he's got this poor white woman, and he's ripped her blouse open as her bosoms are exposed, and he's going to go and, I don't think they're going to go and play patty cake later, if you know what I mean. And so, this is what is it? Destroy the mad brute, enlist in the army. This is designed to inflame your passions if you're a fairly racist white guy, you know, in America, that you got this dark-skinned, ape that's going to rape this white lady. Truth. So, here's a fun one, right? Pile on your dollars, right? You buy Liberty Bonds, right? You're going to be driving the pylon, the head of which is shaped like Kaiser Wilhelm's head. And Uncle Sam, of course, is working the machine back there. He's just sort of pounding Kaiser Wilhelm away. So that's a fun one. And of course, Uncle Sam's got his sleeves rolled up. Anytime Uncle Sam rolls his sleeve up, you know that somebody's ass is going to get kicked. So that's what's taking place there. So more sleeve rolling from Uncle Sam. He's got the Liberty Bond that he's going to use to, I think, go and spank Kaiser Wilhelm with it. So that should be pretty fun to watch. And the most famous, probably the most famous bit of propaganda the United States has ever cranked out comes from World War I. I want you for U.S. Army. And this is what you would see on, billboards, on street sides, everywhere in the United States. Have it at the in front of the recruiting station. The idea is an American, Uncle Sam, he's pointing at you. We'll see it get parodied and reused and that kind of thing as time would go on, right? German enemy, this is from the St. Louis Globe Democrat. German enemy of the United States, hanged by mob. Sounds like some kind of spy. Spy slips into the United States. No, he's a worker. Collinsville man killed for abusing Wilson. Yeah, this guy who had a thick German accent, he was a socialist, and he didn't agree with Woodrow Wilson in his prosecution of the war, and he spoke out against it, and so eventually a lynch mob went and got him and hung him from a tree. So, there you go. Right? This is how violently anti-German a lot of people became. What you're going to have is a typical sort of progressive response. Progressives, they look at society, they see problems, and their knee-jerk reaction is, government. The government's going to solve this. We got a new problem now, and that's not social inequality. It is war. Well, when you only got one play in your playbook, which is government, that's what's going to happen here. So government is going to be seen by these progressives under Woodrow Wilson as a solution to this problem. Right? Now, the nation is woefully unprepared for a massive war. both in terms of the military and the economy. Right? So to gear the United States up for the war, Congress is going to allow Wilson power to organize the economy through the War Industries Board. Right? Now, the WIB is going to be somewhat weak compared to its World War II counterparts, but it does allow the government nominal economic controls over production, prices, and wages. Conceivably, basically like everything. This is what you're going to make, this is what you're going to charge us for since we're buying from you to go and blow the Germans up, and this is what you're going to pay your workers. The government also asked labor not to strike. Actually, ask is really not the right word. More like threaten striking workers with the draft. You would see these signs up in these industrial factories that if you go on strike and the plant isn't producing artillery shells or tires for Jeeps or whatever it is that they're going to be making, and you would see these signs up that say "work or fight." And you would think the positive side is, oh, okay, we get a war job or go and join the military. No, it was more of a threat. If you don't work, you're gonna go fight. We're gonna draft you, and we're gonna send you overseas. And so that was the reminder from the Wilson administration that, hey, I've been pretty friendly to labor, but right now you guys go on strike, and it's off to the army with you. So you better not do it. All right. Women are also going to play an incredibly important role. They're going to be joining the workforce for the first time in relatively large numbers. It won't be quite the same kind of contribution that you'll see women will make in World War II, but up until that time, this is the first major female participation in terms of economic contributions to a major American war. They're still working towards suffrage. We'll deal with that in the next section. However, women were also affected on the home front. We're still seeing that women, for the most part, are homemakers here in American history. And they're asked to use their powers of command over the household to be a part of the war effort as well. They were asked to do without so that the soldiers could have more, basically so that the supplies for the military could continue to flow. They were asked to turn down the heat, turn off the lights, buy no meat on certain days, grow their own vegetables in the backyard. And so this was the idea of this as well. And so here you've got a young boy and two old people, right? An old couple. Neither one of them are going to go off and fight and sort of chuck hand grenades at the Kaiser's troops. It's just not going to happen. So I guess they're out of the war. No, you're misunderstanding. This is a national war. Everybody is fighting no matter what you're doing. And so they are fighting, right? Our food is fighting. They've got a victory garden planted out back. This is food that they're not going to have to buy at the store because they're growing it at home, and they are going to participate in the war effort even though they're either too young or too old to go off and fight. This is something that the United States Food Administration put out for housewives. And they were supposed to hang this up in the kitchen or wherever, and it had all the restrictions, Sunday through Saturday, of what you were supposed to buy. All these meals that you're supposed to prepare for your families, what was restricted, what you were and weren't supposed to do, so that way it would preserve enough resources for the military to be able to buy food on the market without having the prices go up too much, and there's going to be more available for the soldiers to be able to win the war. And those Tuesdays, all meals meatless. Meatless Tuesdays for this. And of course, this caused a lot of restaurants to simply close down on Tuesday. There are not a lot of, you go to a lot of restaurants, there aren't a lot of ones that have sort of a vegetarian menu here in 1917, 1918. And so a lot of these places, this little diner is just shut down on Tuesdays. So the effect on the American civilian population is pretty pronounced, even though they're not going to go and sort of be on the battlefield. What about these guys that are on the battlefield? All right, America's army is untrained and inexperienced and really basically had no modern equipment. The United States didn't really need it, right? The last sort of group of people they fought, were the Spanish, and that was quick. It was over with, in just a few months, and there was no sort of major war that needed for that kind of thing. I mean, who were going to fight? The Indians? By this point, they're all on reservations. The Mexicans? They can't even keep a government together, much less field a huge army to invade the United States. So there's really no reason to spend all this money on having, a million men in the military and to have, machine guns and rifles and all this kind of modern equipment. And so, while it seems like idiocy for the Germans to provoke the United States to declare war, the Germans did this with the understanding that it's probably going to take the Americans about a year. It's going to take them about a year to really get all their forces kind of go from scratch to fairly large military, to get them well trained, to get them equipped, and then get them across the Atlantic to go on the battlefield. It turns out that that's about right. It takes the United States a little over a year from its declaration of war until the summer of 1918 to make a huge impact on the battlefield, right, before they're starting to feel large formations. Okay? Now, by 1918, by the time the United States sends up enough soldiers to really make much of an impact, the war situation had radically changed. All right, in the previous autumn, the Germans had knocked the Russians out of the war. A communist revolution had taken over the country. This was instigated by Germany. Germany had managed to sneak Vladimir Lenin back into Russia, who then leads this sort of Bolshevik revolution and implants a communist government and pulls the Russians out of the war, which means now that the Germans can take all their forces that have been fighting on the Eastern Front and shift them over to fight on the Western Front. So really you've got a race here in the spring of 1918. Who is going to win first? Is it going to be Germany with its army to reach the Western Front, or is it going to be America to come in and reinforce Britain and France? And it turns out the Germans are going to win. The army had been working on a series of experiments of how to break through these trench lines, how to attack them without taking massive casualties. And in what was called Operation Michael, they are going to demonstrate that they pretty well got this figured out. And it's going to radically change their tactics in dealing with trench warfare. German forces are going to, they're going to attack in small units, they're going to avoid major forts and major fortified areas, and they're going to circle around behind these areas, they're going to make these breaches, and then they're going to send for aid. And if you advanced 6 miles in a year, 1915, 1916, 1917, that was considered a good year. You know, 6 miles closer to Berlin or something like that. The Germans are going to be advancing 6 miles a day. They're going to rupture the Allied line at 5 points. They come perilously close to Paris. But American reinforcements, African-American troops, are going to block them at Chateau Thierry, and they're going to save Paris from falling. And basically, this is the Germans' sort of last throw of the dice. These are the last reserves. This is the last ability they have to sort of launch a major attack and to win the war on the ground. And they're stopped. They're defeated. They're pushed backwards, and they suffer heavy casualties in doing so. But fortunately for the Allies, the American army is finally ready to make a contribution. So here you can see a couple of American soldiers that are receiving training on this water-cooled machine gun from a British non-commissioned officer, because there aren't a lot of American non-commissioned officers and trainers who have the experience fighting the Germans. And so you're going to see that the Americans are going to be relying pretty heavily on the British and the French. Here you can see how desperate it is getting in the spring of 1918. That Paris civilians are called out to dig trenches around the city of Paris, because the assumption was, well, the Germans have broken through. They're headed right towards the capital. And so we may need to have to stop them on the outskirts. But fortunately, elements here of the United States Army, particularly these African-American soldiers, are going to stop the Germans and prevent them from capturing Paris. And then we're going to see the United States is going to go on offense. One of the major impacts that you'll see the United States has is not a quantifiable one. You know, we can talk about how many troops the United States put into, how many 100,000 guys they had here, and what weapons they had available, tanks and airplanes and machine guns and stuff like that. But something that is just as important as that, if not more important, and you can't quantify, is morale. And what you're going to see here is the morale of the British and the French was low. They've been fighting this war since 1915. They've been attacking these trenches. They've been sort of banging their head against this. They've been cut to pieces a bunch of times. They're sort of hanging on by their fingernails. They're not very excited about fighting. And of course, the Americans haven't been in this. And so they're heading to the front. They're singing these songs. They're telling the French and the British, you guys get out of the way. The Americans are here. We'll show you how to do this. And it actually had a very electrifying effect on the rest of the Allies. And you'll see that French and British morale is going to pick up. And the Americans are going to help turn the tide against the Germans. And they're going to join in a series of large-scale attacks all throughout the southern and central sectors of the lines in the summer and eventually the autumn of 1918. U.S. forces are also sent to attack communist Russia to try to stabilize that country. Don't think that the communists are going to forget about that, the attacks of the United States on Archangel and Murmansk. But it's going to be American infantry, tanks, and airplanes that are going to make a significant, if not decisive, contribution to the Allied drive to push the Germans ever steadily backward. All right? By the autumn of 1918, the Germans are really finished. Militarily and economically, the people back home are starving, and we're going to see that as riots begin to break out and mutinies in Germany, the German high command basically says, okay, we're going to have to give up the war effort and bring the army home to prevent mass chaos inside Germany. And so on November 11th, 1918, we're going to see that the armistice is agreed to and the fighting is going to come to an end. So here's some American soldiers, these are Marines at Belle Isle Wood, and they're just letting the Germans have it here. They're enthused about the fighting. They earned the nickname from the Germans, the Teufelshunden, right, the devil dogs, and this is something that the Marines still use as a moniker for themselves to this day. Most famous of these American soldiers in World War I was Alvin York from Tennessee. This is Sergeant York. He single-handedly captured something like 100 German prisoners in a single day, breached the Siegfried line of defenses. He just sort of went on a one-man killing spree. If you were to write this and put this in a movie, this guy just goes on just one sort of amazing butt-kicking spree in a single day. A lot of us are sort of shaking, oh, that could never really happen. No, it did. This is what happened. And of course, he just sort of went buck wild and became sort of the number one American hero of World War I. This is Eddie Rickenbacker, the number one flying ace for the United States in World War I, in front of his biplane on the tarmac. And so all of this is going to sort of push the Germans towards having to admit that they are defeated. So this is going to lead to now a peace treaty. Woodrow Wilson had promised that this would be the war to end all wars. We're going to figure out a way to make sure that we're never going to have war again, which is nice to say, but is sort of irrational if you think about it. All right. So the leaders of Europe and the rest of the world are going to meet in Versailles, France. Versailles, it's the palace it's the old palace of the kings in France. And it's right outside Paris. And so they're going to get together and they're going to try to discuss a peace treaty to create a peace that will last for everybody. Now, Woodrow Wilson arrives as the first president of the United States to leave the country while he's president to negotiate these the treaty directly. And he wants to ensure a peace without victors based on his 14 points. We don't want the idea that the winners are going to rub the loser's nose in it, because if we do that, then the losers are just going to want to fight us in another war, and that's not our goal. Right? This view is very popular with the people, both the people in the United States, and when he gives some speeches in France, oh yeah, that sounds really good. The leaders of these countries, these other countries, Britain, France, and Italy, they want a peace for the victors. We fought this war, and we won it, and we spent our money and our blood, and we want to win. We want to be the winner. So Wilson proposes new nationalities and new nation states, and use the idea of national determination. These countries are going to get to vote for their own countries in Eastern Europe. So the Big Four of Britain, France, Italy, and of course the United States, the other members of the Big Four, yeah, that's no problem. We're going to take Germany and Austria-Hungary apart, break them up into these small little countries. We'll give the Hungarians a country, and the Romanians a country, and the Polish people will have a country. And that involves us taking the knife and just cutting up the countries that we just fought in the war. So super. All these little ethnic groups that have their own little country will feel good about themselves. Okay? Well, if you're going to do that with these countries in Europe, well, you really should do that on a worldwide scale, right? Wilson says that the same idea should be used for colonies around the world. I mean, Africa should be nation states, and Asia should be nation states, and islands in the ocean should be nation states. And the Big Four said, no, those are our colonies. You're not going to take stuff away. In fact, the few colonies that these countries had around the world, parts of the Ottoman Empire and some of these other islands and these coastal areas in West Africa and Asia that Germany and Austria-Hungary did have, Britain and France are going to pick those up. So not only do they not lose their colonies to self-determination, they pick up colonies. Japan is also going to gain as well, despite the fact that China had been on the Allied side since the beginning. Japan is kind of a latecomer to the party. But this is going to create a great deal of enmity between Japan and China, and we'll see that it'll play out rather badly in the 1930s. So what does Versailles do? What does the Treaty of Versailles do to the Central Powers? All right, Austria-Hungary ceases to exist. All right, the Habsburg Emperor, by the end of the war, revolutions all throughout the empire. He realizes, his government tells him, "Well, we can't keep things together." So, okay, I quit. All right, the Habsburg Emperor abdicates. The empire is broken up into a lot of these small nationalist countries, right? The problem with this is when you zoom in, most of these countries have smaller ethnic minorities within them. They're not a homogeneous little whole. And of course, you've got the problem of, well, what about all these German people that are stuck inside of Hungary, right? What about all these different ethnic groups that are stuck inside these other countries where they're now an ethnic minority? Yeah. So it's not a very easy fix to understand. While you can get a voting majority, what about these other people that feel like they're being left out in the cold, right? Well, the Germans, they're forced to pay a heavy debt of reparations and shame. We'll talk about that in a little more detail here in a second. The Ottoman Caliph, he's going to hold on for a little while, despite the fact that the non-Turkish, especially the Arabic parts of the empire, eventually is going to break free. But by 1922, the empire falls apart, the Caliph's going to abdicate, and as I mentioned, the empire itself, the Ottoman Empire, is going to break up into these component parts, much of which is going to get snapped up by the British which are going to get Iraq, and the French, which are going to get Syria. And so this is going to be a major problem. Now, when you look at the Germans after Versailles, you can see this little political cartoon done from the German perspective of, you got Woodrow Wilson and these other leaders here of the Allies, and this is sort of the Germans, the German people being led to the gallows. They're being led to the guillotine. They're going to be executed. All right. You've got to understand where they are in 1918. Okay, the German people, they're impoverished. They are. There was even questions like, are we going to be able to survive the winter of 1918, 1919? We're going to starve to death as a result of this. You lay on that the fact that they've spent all this money in the war, they've been impoverished by the blockade, and now, okay, you owe us a huge debt of reparations. You got to pay the Allies all this money. Okay. They're going to lose all of their colonies around the world, which of course was a major source of economic resource, which they could have used to pay off the debt, and of course a huge chunk of their home territory. So how are we going to pay these people back? And of course, what are we going to do about all this lost territory? And they also were forced to sign the War Guilt Clause, which admitted that, well, World War I was Germany's fault. They started the war. Which isn't really totally true. Was Germany integral in helping start World War I? Yeah, they really were. Did they start it like all by themselves? No, that's really not totally true. They're also forced to decrease their military down to 100,000 men. They had to get rid of, they couldn't have any tanks, they couldn't have submarines, military aircraft, heavy artillery. And while 100,000 men, there'll be a lot to kind of fit in this room. For a country the size of Germany with its population, 100,000 men is basically just a police force. So it's not even very effective at defending the country if it's attacked. So it looks like the Allies, they want us to die. What little resources we have, they want to take. The ability to generate more resources, they're going to take. They're going to shame us into saying, well, this is the war was all your fault. And then if somebody attacks you, we're going to remove your ability to defend yourselves. So, yeah, Germany, we want you to die. That, seems kind of an extreme thing to say today, but when you look at it from the perspective of these Germans here after World War I, maybe they do. So, when you look at the League of Nations, the way that it was supposed to work was it was supposed to prevent another world war. So, right off the bat, well, that's a failure, right? Because these guys were supposed to discuss their grievances openly with each other rather than fight these wars against each other. So nations would act in concert if somebody did make an aggressive move, somebody invaded somebody else's country, and so the other countries was no, you're not supposed to do that, we're going to send troops, we're going to stop you, right? But, of course, who wants to do that right after World War I? That was so much fun losing tens of millions of people. Wilson, of course, realizes that he's losing most of his proposals. That, we need to have peace without victors. We don't need to rub the Central Powers' nose in it. And, of course, Britain, France, and Italy, no, we're going to rub their noses in it. That's the whole point of being, the winner. And so Wilson said, fine, you want all this stuff, you want the money, you want the colonies, you want all this land, you're going to have to vote for the League of Nations. So, treaty ratification is contingent on the League of Nations. Okay, fine, we'll ratify it, right? So it does ensure its creation. But the way that it actually works is that the victorious nations, especially Britain and France, could use their influence militarily, economically, and politically to basically gang up on Germany and any of the other weaker powers they didn't like. The Soviet Union, anybody that really opposed them. So anybody that wasn't in the club, they really kind of steered clear of open concourse in the League because the League didn't really matter. And it didn't matter what you did. You just had to get Britain and France's approval. But what about the United States? Well, Wilson, when he returns home from Versailles, he says, we're going to have peace without victors, we're going to have peace in our time, that kind of stuff. And so, the United States Senate, though, has to ratify the treaty that Wilson negotiates. The president doesn't have dictatorial powers to negotiate treaties with other countries. The Senate has to ratify this, okay? And the Senate has some major objections to the League of Nations and how it was supposed to operate. Now, the fear that these guys, like Henry Cabot Lodge and some of these other people had, was that the United States would then be drawn into future wars, that the League would order U.S. troops into fighting, and of course, the Senate is saying that's Congress's job to declare war. It's our determination as a nation who we're going to fight, and not some foreign body of League of Nations. And so, how is this going to operate? Well, Wilson really, at this point, he refused to compromise. He had had a stroke. He was getting pretty irascible. And in years past, he had sort of challenged Congress directly. You come at me, oh, you're not going to do it. Oh, I'm going to go right at you. And he went around the country here in 20, and he's telling me, all right, you guys need to vote these guys out of Congress, and you don't need to do this. The Senate, they're going to vote down the treaty, and you need to show them that you want them to ratify the treaty. And so he loses. The Republicans win. The Republicans win in 1920 because a lot of these guys up for election in the Senate, they come back and they're like, hey, this treaty's no good. And you'll see that this political cartoon gives you an idea of kind of how Americans felt like this. The United States is sort of like the Titanic. It's a great big ship, but all it takes is one iceberg kind of floating in the water. League of Nations, foreign treaties, foreign entanglements, treaty with France and England to sink the ship of state. We need to stay away from this kind of stuff. And so the strongest nation on the earth, the United States, refused its leadership position. We don't want to have anything to do with the League of Nations. We're not going to get involved. And so Wilson's sort of failure to work with the Senate and get it to a point where, yeah, we'll join the League of Nations, really is going to be problematic. So this is the end of our section on Woodrow Wilson and World War I.